Oops, a little bit of lag time for me there. In this screencast, we're going to talk about a phenomenon called ocean warming, which is clearly related to global warming. So let's just get going. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Don't worry, that's not a COVID cough. Okay, so greenhouse gases trap heat, which makes the atmosphere warmer. Well, it turns out that fortunately, we have this thing called the ocean, which is made out of water, and it has an amazingly high specific heat capacity. So that means it's able to trap most of the heat energy that is produced in this process. So, excuse me, not burped. Oh my God, oh, what a mess. Okay, so basically, in the last century, air temperature has gone up. Not even last century, really, since 1970. The global atmospheric temperature has gone up by about half a degree Celsius. Now, if it wasn't for the oceans, what would have happened is we would expect if we didn't have oceans, that amount of heat being trapped would have caused the air temperature to go up by 35 degrees. So instead of having 15 degrees as sort of the average air temperature right now, it'd be more like 50 degrees on average. I mean, that's insane, but don't worry, nothing's going to happen to the ocean. The point I'm trying to make is simply that the oceans are a major, what we call a heat sink. Just like they're a carbon sink, they're also a heat sink. They absorb a lot of heat energy from the atmosphere and keep the atmosphere from getting warm. If you ever lived near a beach, you've noticed this, right? Even on a hot day, it tends to be a little bit cool near the beach because it has the ability to absorb so much heat energy. Now, again, it's because water has this very high specific heat capacity, and consider the fact that oceans cover 70% of the surface of the Earth, more than that. So that just means that the vast majority of the heat energy that has been produced during the process of global warming has been absorbed by the ocean. In fact, probably about more than 90%, 93% or more of the heat energy that's been trapped by global warming now resides in the oceans, not in the atmosphere. And again, it has to do with the fact that it has this very high specific heat capacity and it covers so much of the Earth's surface. Now, what happens when this heat energy is transferred into the ocean? Well, what happens is that the sea surface temperature changes. Now, it's important to point out that this heating is not the entire ocean, down to a depth of 5,000 meters. Instead, it's really just the top few meters, because as this water is heated up, you have thermal expansion, and that makes it less dense. So the warm water tends to float on the surface. And maybe you've noticed this if you've ever gone to a lake or a still body of salt water. The top might be warm. As you swim down, all of a sudden it gets very cold. It's called a thermocline. So you reach this temperature barrier because the warm water is floating on top of the cold water below. Now, so it's really just the very, very top few meters of water that have been heated by this process. But if we look at those, we see this graph here, which is a bit alarming. Okay, so this is what's known as an anomaly, a temperature anomaly graph. So what you do is you take this time period from 1880 to, in this case, it looks like maybe went to 2015. And you come up with an average of the sea temperature around the world. Okay, what is the average? All right, and we're going to call it a zero anomaly. So this line here is basically the average. Well, what we see then is we're gonna mark each year how it compares to the average. And you'll see way back in the 1880s, and of course, the farther back in time, the less reliable the data was. But what you see is, it deviated a little bit, and if anything, it deviated on the cold side. Then what happens is, basically, after World War II, sometimes you'd have warm years, sometimes cold years, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. But from 1970 onwards, it's just been getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And this is the same time that carbon dioxide has been building in the atmosphere. And so clearly those top few meters of the ocean are getting much hotter than what they used to be as a consequence of absorbing all this energy that is being trapped by greenhouse gases. Now, let's just talk about some of the many consequences that we could expect from heating the world's ocean surface. Okay, so let's start off with, in no particular order, let's talk about cyclonic storms. Okay, so tropical cyclonic storms, typhoons in the Western Pacific, hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic, cyclones, they're called the Indian Ocean, whatever you want to call them, these large organized storm systems that start in the equatorial waters. They are primarily driven by evaporation and the condensation in the cloud, which releases heat energy. And so the more warm water there is, the more these storms are going to be gaining power. Now, it turns out there isn't any evidence that global warming is making these things happen more often, but there's definitely evidence that what's happening is they're becoming more intense. Now, usually when people hear about storm intensity, we think winds, and it is true that the number of high category, category 4 and 5 on the Beaufort scale winds tend to those type of storms do happen more often. Okay, but more significantly, there's a lot more water. That's the one thing they've really noticed, that there's so much more evaporated water in these storms now. And what that does is that results in a lot more flooding, both coastal flooding and inland flooding. And when that happens, all that water drains into the ocean. And basically you get a lot of coastal erosion and riverbank erosion. So that's certainly one big consequence of global ocean warming. Another one is sea level is going to rise. Now, most people, when they think about the rising sea level, we think in terms of, well, we're melting the continental ice sheets. Well, that's true, and that definitely contributes, right? However, it turns out a bigger contributor is simply the fact that we're warming 70% of the world's surface, right? So basically, if you warm water, it expands like anything. And so what's happened is that this warming has caused the expansion of water over time. So what we see here is, again, this is basically, we say at 1900, what we'll call the year 1900, that was zero. Okay, the zero increase, zero change. What we see is even really before World War II, we were still seeing this increase, and it's maybe this was just a natural phenomenon. Maybe a lot of climate deniers say that has nothing to do with humans. They're wrong. But then we see like this sort of hiatus that happened. And again, when you get around 1970, it all starts to change. Now, by the way, all this here, this is from tide gauge data, which is much less reliable. Satellite data started here in the 1990s, and you see a little curve here, right? So we see that it is rising at an expanding rate. So we can use LIDAR now and other techniques to measure the exact height of the ocean. So we see definitely they're going up at about a rate of 0.25 or basically 2.5 millimeters a year, or 2.5 centimeters per decade, which doesn't seem like much, but when you compound that around all the coastlines of the world, it's significant, and it's happening at an accelerated rate. So what are the consequences? So we talked about this in an earlier screencast. Obviously you have like coastal communities that are going to be affected, but let's just look at some of the things from an environmental standpoint. So as sea level rises up, it's going to start to erode the land, right? So it's going to move inland, which means it's going to erode the shorelines. Well, shorelines contain some pretty precious commodities from an environmental standpoint. We're talking about mangrove forest. We're talking about coastal wetland areas, these salt marshes, and these are really important ecosystems. They're some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. They're as productive as rainforests. They serve as the spawning area and where the fish come and lay their eggs, and then the fish hatch. It's a place for them to grow bigger and have access to a lot of food. So it's really important for the survival of a vast number of fish species on the planet, including coral reef fish. And so by eroding these away, we're eroding this important, crucial habitat for much of the world's fish population. And these things also have an ability, if you recall, to filter out nutrients that come down the rivers and keep those nutrients from coming out to the ocean. Now you think like, well, we want nutrients in the ocean. Yes, we do, to an extent. But remember, when you put in too much, you get a rain event, and all of a sudden all these nutrients go out of the ocean. What's going to happen? You're going to get algae blooms, and you're going to get eutrophication. So what happens is, now you can get the eutrophication as a consequence of coastal erosion and allowing these nutrients to wash down rivers and go out to sea. But also keep this in mind: algae just grows better when it's warmer. Warm water grows algae better. So algae blooms tend to be a summer phenomenon in much of the temperate parts of the world. So we find that is when sea surface temperatures go up, you get more frequent and pervasive and intense algal blooms, which of course you recall, those are going to lead to eutrophication. As those cells die, they fall to the bottom, and you get these dead zones. But also, a lot of these are algae that release toxins. Okay, so some of these like dinoflagellates, whatever, they release toxins, and so they are poisonous to fish and people as well. So these algal blooms are harmful in their own right, apart from eutrophication. But eutrophication is really the biggie, okay? Because it denies all, like everything that is everything that lives needs oxygen, right? I mean, like even plants have to respire, which means you need oxygen. And if you recall, when now we've eroded the coastline, so all this nutrient comes out here. Now I get this algal bloom, and warm water makes the algal bloom even more intense, which means there's going to be more dead ones coming to the bottom, getting eaten by bacteria, which are going to then respire up and use all that oxygen. So we get these hypoxic areas that don't have enough oxygen to support fish species or really any species. So they're just devoid of life. We call them dead zones. And what we're finding is causing these dead zones to become larger, more persistent in terms of the time that they last, and often to happen more frequently. And it just has to do with the fact that algae, like bacteria, like a lot of things, they prefer warmth. And when single cell organisms, when you give them warmth, they tend to reproduce more quickly. Now, we talked about this in another screencast as well, but we should talk about it here. A big problem with global ocean warming is coral bleaching. So just as you can get heat waves, here in Korea, in the air, in the atmosphere, you can get heat waves in the ocean too. And when these heat waves happen, if a coral has a fairly limited zone of tolerance when it comes to temperatures, and when the temperatures get a little bit too hot, like around 30 degrees, what happens is corals are basically a symbiotic combination of these animals. We call them polyps. And they have within them these algae, and these algae basically provide most of the food and oxygen that these corals need, and in return they're providing these algae a place to live. So it's symbiotic. But what happens is when it gets too hot, and I'm not going to pretend to understand why, they expel these algae, and the coral loses its color because the color came from the algae, and so these more frequent heat waves lead to more frequent coral bleaching events. Now, the thing is, a coral bleaching event doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to end up with all the coral being dead. However, there's food and nutrients and oxygen supplied by these algae that have left. And so the corals now are having a harder time surviving. So there is a greater risk of mortality in corals when bleaching events happen. And so, the map is pretty dire. If you look at where coral bleachings has occurred in just the last, 10 years, about 70% of the world's tropical reefs have experienced a coral bleaching event to some level. And even more alarming, of the world's coral in the last decade, about a third of it has died. And when it dies, you just have the skeleton left behind, right? And it doesn't get repopulated. It's not like polyps come back and live on it. They have to start all over again. So these heat waves in the ocean are really hitting coral reefs hard. Remember, coral reefs are really important habitat for much of the world's biodiversity. Now, we've said this before. We talked about thermal pollution, and we talked about carbon dioxide, that gases are less soluble in warm water than they are in cold water. So it stands to reason that as the ocean's surface gets warmer, there's going to be a depletion of oxygen, and we certainly find that to be true. And so now, it's not like there's all the oxygen is gone. It's not like a dead zone. Okay, so it's not like what we get from a eutrophying event. However, there's some fish species, so pelagic fish, that are very kinetic. Okay, so like we're talking tunas and billfish, like marlins and sharks. These fish, they need a lot of oxygen. They have very powerful metabolisms, and they need to fuel their muscles, which is what we eat, right? And so like we like tuna, we like sailfish because we like mahi because they've got a lot of meat, and that meat basically is muscle that needs oxygen. And so these fish are the ones that are most effective. And so we find this, they can't live in these regions. So they have to migrate away from them, which shrinks the amount of habitat they have available to them. And also, it basically stresses them. So overall, we find that there's less of them, and those that are there have less body mass because they have less habitat in which to thrive. And then the last thing is thermal stratification. Actually, this may not even be the last one to say. So thermal stratification basically means that with as the ocean gets warmer and it messes with the conveyor belt and with the wind systems, the Hadley cell slows down. We find is that instead of having the eastern part of an ocean basin having upwelling and the western region having the warm water piled up, it tends to spread out. So it would tend to get a pretty consistent, fairly deep layer of warm water across the ocean basin. And as a consequence, this puts a cap on upwelling. So there's definitely been a diminishment of the amount of nutrients brought up from the deep ocean to the coastal areas on the eastern sides of ocean basins. And that definitely causes a collapse of the food web there. And what happens is fish will swim away from there. So there's been this mass migration of fish as a result of this. So we find this fisheries keep accurate track of what they catch, and now we're finding these fishing ships that operate at 50 and 60 degrees latitude are starting to catch tropical fish. Why are those fish there? Well, it's because there's not enough nutrients to support and oxygen to support them back where they were. So they've moved to find other places where they can live. And what happens then is as they move in, now you got more fish trying to live on the same amount of resource. So there's increased competition, which causes all the species to be stressed. And this results in the increased mortality of both the native populations and the migrant populations. And so there's just this disruption of the overall ecosystem of the ocean, which leads to a drop in biodiversity. And don't forget, fish are a really important part of the human diet, and we rely on wild fish populations to feed a significant amount of this world's growing population. And this ocean warming is affecting those populations in a very profound way. All right. So I know this is really getting depressing. I think that's why they put it at the end of the year, right? So it's like, oh, but now it's just, but we're looking at the size of it now. It's kind of like, oh, it's so terrible. So I'm really sorry about that. I don't mean to really seem like it's such a bummer. I mean, you know what? You're going to be fine, but we need to do something about this. We can't just ignore the problem. We have to deal with the problem.